sea or air. Military dominance is always won by command of the highest ground. SFA works with industry partners such as Sierra Nevada Corporation and their Dream Chaser program to examine what's in the art of possible for future capabilities. The Space Force Association provides an opportunity to research, inform, and advocate for a strong Space Force. Show your support by signing up today at ussfa.org, catalyzing space power at home and on the frontier.
Hello and welcome to a very special edition of Space Warfighter Talks. I'm your host, Bill Wolf, the president and founder of the Space Force Association, and I'm honored to be here today with General Chance Salty Saltzman, the Chief of Space Operations. Sir, thanks so much for taking time today.
It's an honor to be here.
Sir, it's been a couple years since we spoke about what was going on in the Space Force, and many things have changed. But not many things have changed in terms of the threat that's presented to your space superiority mission. Specifically, sir, if you could share with the audience the time in 2007 when you're sitting on the JSPOC floor and you had to respond to a very real threat that was being presented at that specific time by a launch of an anti-satellite weapon. Sir, can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Absolutely. So you got to go back to a time when the Ops Center, the Joint Space Operations Center at the time, was really a nascent capability. I mean, we were in a very small room in the third floor of the 14th Air Force headquarters. You've been there. And it was mostly about operations at that point. And our job was to collect status, mostly, you know, the space domain awareness, we called it space situational awareness back then. What's going on in orbit? And we had indications that the Chinese were going to conduct this test. But to be honest, I think there was this feeling that, you know, it was just going to be a test and our job would just be to monitor what was going to happen. But I remember very clearly the radar operator who's looking at his chat rooms connected to the ground radars, you know, spread around the world. And he looked back over his shoulder and he said, "We have multiple headcount." And that's space domain awareness talk for one object in space just became many objects in space. And so it looked very positive that there had been not only a test of this anti-satellite capability, but a destructive test that created a debris field. And I just remember vividly the feeling that this is a pivot point in the space community, in space operations, and that we're going to have to look differently about how we operate in space from that day on. And for those of us that are neck deep in the business, we did have to think differently from that day on. But that was 15 years ago, and Space Force is only 3 years old. So it took a while to start to be able to discuss these in normal terms. And that's really what the space community had been doing until finally we realized, hey, the threats are bad enough. Our dependencies on space are strong enough that we're going to have to focus differently, and it made sense to build the service. And now you have the United States Space Force focused on those threats.
It's a really great way to summarize everything that's happened in the past. Now let's take that example and apply it to modern day life. So how critical is the space superiority mission in support of modern day warfare? And how do you present that to the Joint Force?
Well, it's a great question because we need to always be evaluating. It's a dynamic security environment. So you can never just sit back and say, okay, we got this figured out. We've got to continually monitor how we respond, what the threats are, how space is being used from the tactical level all the way to the strategic level. And the best current example, I think, is what we're witnessing in Ukraine, the conflict there. And you know, I'm a history major, so I don't like to draw too many lessons learned while an event like this is unfolding. But I think it would be fair to say that what we're observing is the criticality of space in modern warfare. And you can look at it through a number of different lenses. The ability to deny single satellite capabilities became very obvious very early in this conflict. the ability to cyber attack ground networks that facilitate space capabilities became very obvious early. Those vulnerabilities became obvious early in the conflict. And then the commercial augmentation of space capabilities showed its merits. And the commercial, we all know about Starlink's capabilities and the fact that it's a disaggregated, more than 1,000 satellites, creating this layer of satellite communications is much tougher to target. And so it's proven out to be a more resilient architecture. So we've got to take all that in. Space is critical. Adversaries are going to attack space. It's critical on the ground as well as in space. And a disaggregated architecture becomes more resilient, and that matters in terms of creating combat capability.
And as you prepare Guardians for operations in this contested, degraded, operationally limited environment, how do you ensure that they're prepared to operate in this new contested environment that's been created?
Yeah, the Space Force, our responsibilities are to generate and present combat-ready, combat-capable forces to the combatant commanders. What I was worried about is that we would focus on the weapon systems, the systems that created the effect, and miss the fact that if you don't have trained personnel, operational concepts, and the tactics to execute with the weapon systems against a thinking adversary, that you only had half the equation. In fact, I would say another observation from Ukraine is you've got, on paper, a very capable Russian military, but they didn't necessarily have the training. They didn't necessarily have the operational concepts for multi-domain operations. They didn't have C2 structures and sustainment capability, and they're coming up a little short. And so that's really the focus, is making sure that not only do we have the systems to do the mission, but that our operators have the training, the experience, and we have validated tactics that actually enable those capabilities. And so we have to build the infrastructure and the processes and procedures to make sure they've got what they need, whether it's a test and training infrastructure, simulators that can replicate adversary threats and the interactions you would get, multiple units working together to solve operational challenges. All of that needs to take place before we get into an actual conflict, so that our operators are fully ready. And that's really the priority that I'm going after.
Sir, understand that. Could you just, for the audience, explain a little bit about what that testing, tactics, and training process looks like in your own words?
Yeah, it starts with operational concepts. You say, how is it that we will control the space domain so that we can do what we want to do with space assets, achieve the effects that we want to achieve, while denying the adversary the ability to use their space capabilities to target ground forces and maritime forces and air forces? That's a classic definition of control of a domain. And so we have to have the operational concepts. Is how are we going to do that? Like, what's the plan? And we have to test those to make sure we don't create debris fields. We're trying to be responsible users in space, but we still have to be able to disrupt an adversary. So how do you do that? And then second is you take the operational concept and you start to look at the systems you have and build the tactics, techniques, and procedures that the operators will need to employ. How do I move satellite communications beams? How do I detect a rendezvous proximity ops that an adversary is trying to do? How do I do that in real time? What are those techniques, procedures? And then you have to practice it. And you have to practice it on a range where you can control all the inputs. You have to practice it against what we would call an opposition force, aggressors, to use that vernacular. Because it's a thinking adversary, and it's going to be dynamic. And how do your operators respond in that dynamic adversarial set of conditions? The side that practices the best will have an advantage early in the conflict. And so that's what I want to do, is make sure we have the skills and the experience on day one of the conflict.
Thank you, sir. You mentioned presentation of forces, and recently there's been a huge move to make sure that combatant commands had space services that support their operations. Can you talk a little bit about the space service components and where they're at and what you expect them to do?
Yeah, a couple things there. One, We have a legal responsibility to provide forces to all combatant commanders. Now, first and foremost amongst those is U.S. Space Command. That's the command that has the UCP responsibilities to protect and defend and provide all the services for the joint force. So the bulk of our capabilities are provided through the service component that we have at the Space Operations Command. But that's not all the capabilities that are required. And other combatant commanders have additional responsibilities that they have to execute, and there are space capabilities that can help them with those missions. So we have to be prepared to send forces forward to the other combatant commands. Well, you have to also have a command and control capability to receive those forces. So we built, initially, we have 3 right now at Indo-PACOM in Korea and U.S. Central Command, Space Force components, service components, that will have the ability to receive forces and command and control them if forces are attached to those combatant commands. But I think there's another important piece here that's worth tracking, and that's there are some regional activities, there are regional space effects that really probably are best handled by the regional combatant command. If you think about missile warning, for example, it's one thing to use the global enterprise architecture to collect missile warning data. That's U.S. Space Command's responsibility. But as you collect that and process the data and send it down to the warfighters, it gets to the theater. And then it has to go out to all of the warfighters that need to have that missile warning data. And they are moving around continuously, whether it's through dynamic force employment or agile logistics, the bases and the FOBs, it's constantly moving. Only the theater is going to have a good understanding of who needs missile warning. And so we think it's the space experts that are regionally aligned that are keeping track of that procedurally and have the expertise to make sure that missile warning is appropriate. That's a regional activity. And again, it's these regional service components that are going to have the expertise and be there embedded with the other components to understand those requirements best.
And sir, from what I remember as a Deputy Combined Forces Air Component Commander, that resonates with your responsibility and what you had to do out there as well.
Yeah, one of the big takeaways from the job I had as the Deputy Air Component Commander was if you try to centrally manage everything, it's hard to meet the ops tempo of the forward deployed capabilities. As much as you try to connect, there's just a delay in the processing of information that comes from the field, and you have to interpret it and figure out what matters most and get information back. And that there's just a feedback loop that puts some resistance in the circuit that delays those responses. And so the real powerful thing that commanders can do is make sure that decisions can be made at the lowest possible level, out at the forward edge, where that combat feedback is going to be most intense. If we had to pass responsibilities to Afghanistan and to those in Iraq and Syria, because that's where the rubber meets the road, and they had to have the authorities and the responsibilities to match that timing and tempo. Trying to pull that back to the AOC just put a delay in the circuit that I wasn't comfortable living with in a combat feedback environment. And we're going to face adversaries in the future where we're going to have to win the decision cycle. And so we're going to have to push those decisions out into the regions. And I want to make sure that we have space capability that can take on those responsibilities if called on.
Sir, you obviously need the most advanced or capable force based on the technological requirements that space as a domain offers. So what are you doing to ensure that you recruit and retain the highest possible talent in the Space Force?
Well, it's going to be a challenge because it's never going to stop, and we're going to grow, and we're going to have to continue to compete with the other services and with industry for this kind of talent. I like our chances. There's just so much excitement around the Space Force right now that we have far more applicants than we can take on. So initially, the thought is let's make sure we understand exactly the kind of people, the kinds of skills, the kinds of competencies that we need. Let's make sure that we're targeting a wide swath of America to make sure we get the best and brightest from all the locations where they could come from. And it's pretty widespread. And not take maybe the first 1,000 that we see, but no kidding, figure out what a process is so we can get the best 1,000. And that means kind of slowing down in order to make sure you get quality over quantity. We have that luxury because of the numbers that we're trying to take in. And so that's what we're committed to. The harder part is retaining them. Like that, there's excitement that's getting people to come into the Space Force. They learn great skills. They're a part of a great team. They become very marketable. And military lifestyle can be tough, So how do we make sure that we create an environment where they'll stay and they'll stay a part of the team for as long as possible? That's what we're going to focus on. And there's a couple of things that we're doing. One is I want to make sure that when you come into the Space Force that you don't, your skills and your knowledge of technology, for example, doesn't atrophy simply because you're part of the military now and we don't keep up with technology as much. So we're going to deploy them, make sure they're connected to industry, make sure they're connected to academia through our university partner program, through research fellowships. So they go back out and they stay current on what the state of the world is, what the state of the art is in terms of technology and leading edge capabilities, and then come back in and bring that knowledge with them. So keep things fresh inside the Space Force. We're doing things like constructive credit hiring, meaning you work 10 years in cyber defense and you decide, I want to come join the Space Force. Well, we're going to take that 10 years of experience that you bring and give you credit for it. So maybe you enter as a major or a lieutenant colonel or a tech sergeant, and we give you credit for all of that experience that you're bringing to bear. Those are the kind of things that we think are innovative, that we're doing differently for the Space Force to make sure we get the right talent and then hang on to it for as long as we can.
Oh, that makes sense. And well, like you said, with the University Partnership Program, and then the recent announcement of your intermediate developmental education. Could you talk just a little bit about?
Yeah, it's not just intermediate; it's the senior developmental education too, and a very creative approach to leverage an existing, institution, Johns Hopkins, with all the credibility that Johns Hopkins brings to education. We're partnering with them to take care of our both professional military education and just broaden the experience base of a subset of our workforce. But it's not your traditional work college, that's for sure. And we think it's exciting. We know that there's going to be a lot of other services dying to send their people to our work colleges, if you will. But that's innovative. It's a different approach, and we think it's going to pay dividends for our Guardians.
Thank you, sir. You just came back from an international engagement. How important is it to engage internationally with such an important mission as ensuring freedom of action in the space domain?
Yeah, partners are critical to our success. And I mean that from industry. I mean that from our allies, other nations, partnerships that we have, academia, as we talked about, all those. The U.S. Air Force is one of our most important partners. Like we are not designed to take care of ourselves, right? We need help, and that's okay. Like that I think that's a strength as much as anything. But our international partners may be one of the most critical, not the least of which is that one of our asymmetric advantages as a country is that we can put a coalition together. So when we're attacking a problem, a challenge around the world, we don't do it by ourselves. We do it as a coalition. There's a tremendous amount of power in that kind of international resolve, again, as we're seeing in Ukraine, and the deterrence that kind of unity can create. But also, if you think about the fact that we can't afford all the capacity in space that we're going to need. So let's partner with other nations who also have space capacity, and let's share, and let's mission share, and let's work together so that if we're buying something they don't have to, and if they're buying something we don't have to, we can share data, we can share missions, and do this jointly and as a coalition rather than trying to think that the U.S. can buy organically all the capability that it needs. That's going to make us more resilient because we're going to spread those missions out across multiple nations, multiple companies, and get a better result for it.
Yes, sir. Congratulations again on your promotion and assuming the role as Chief of Space Operations. So for your tenure, what are your priorities for the service?
I'm just so fortunate that the team before me, General Raymond and really the whole STARB team, which I was a part of, we just did a good job. I mean, there's really a solid foundation, and I think back on the 3 years, and I think, wow, I can't believe all that was accomplished with COVID in the middle of it, starting from scratch, from basically General Raymond as the only Guardian to 15,000. I mean, it's just a monumental set of accomplishments. And now it's time to deliver, right? So we're shifting from, we're not standing up the Space Force anymore, although there's probably still some work, some cleanup work, like you mentioned, that we're doing with schools and those sort of things. We're established, we're here. Now it's time to deliver, to build capabilities, start producing on some of the promises that we've laid out. And so I say all that because my priorities are not going to surprise you, because they're really a continuation of all the work that's been done. But number one is, we are going to have resilient, ready, combat credible forces. Technology is not enough. The weapon systems that we're developing are not enough. We're gonna invest in the training, the experience, the testing, we're going to validate operational concepts. We're going to put a full set of capabilities together that are resilient in the face of an adversary. And when we do that, it's going to be a very deterrent force. We're going to give pause to any nation that thinks they can cause harm in space. The underpinning of that are the Guardians. And so I've described my second line of effort, my second priority is amplifying the Guardian spirit. Because as I go around the country, I meet these Guardians and they are so excited and they've got so many ideas. And I just want to amplify. That's the word I keep coming back to. I want to take all this goodness that I see and I just want it to explode. Give them the resources, empower them to run with their ideas, basically get out of their way in some instances. I want them to be empowered. I want them to be challenged. That means we got to put structures in place that take care of them appropriately. All the little inconveniences of military life, I want those to pale in comparison to the opportunities they have. And I just know that as small as we are, we're going to have to rely on really creative problem solvers. And if we give them the resources they need and get them excited about it and show them we mean it, I think we'll get that. And then the last one, like we just started to talk about, is these partners. The Air Force, U.S. Space Command, the allies, our other international partners. These are vital to the success of the Space Force. It's got to be a deep, rich partnership based on mutual trust, mutual benefit. Everybody's got to get something out of it. This is not transactional. This is about, you're going to be better because you're dealing with the Space Force, and the Space Force is going to be better because we're partnering with you, your company, your country, your nation. And that takes effort. And so I want to make sure we have the right kind of activities to make sure we get the right kind of partnerships.
Perfect. Thank you, sir. Well, I know how busy you are, so I really do appreciate you taking time out of your extremely busy schedule to talk to the Space Force Association about everything that's going on in the Space Force. On behalf of the entire SFA, happy birthday. I know you just celebrated your third birthday as a service, and look forward to supporting you for many years to come, sir. So have a great Space Force Day, and Semper Supra.
Semper Supra. Thank you.